So chapter 210 of One Punch Man is finally here, and this is probably one of my favorite types of chapters because it goes heavier on the lore building and kind of the backstory building, because we go into Blast's backstory and also Empty Void's backstory in this one. We get to learn about Blast's wife, and we also get to learn about this apparent mysterious scientist that was working with Blast early on in the research for the cubes, and it's kind of left a mystery as to who this is. But I do think I have maybe one or two good ideas of who this could possibly be. A character that we've actually seen before already. So I'm going to probably just go over the chapter in general in the first part of this chapter, or in the first part of this video, and then kind of give my final thoughts and theories at the very end. This chapter is rather short, much like all the other ones that have come out recently, and yes, Saitama is technically in this chapter as well, but he's in like the very end. We'll kind of get to that in a bit, but he doesn't really take center stage in this one. And on that note, we actually got something pretty surprising from Yusuke Murata. We got a chapter cover that actually relates to the chapter itself. A lot of the times we have this like crazy epic fight going on, or like this fight between Saitama and another character, but the chapter cover is like Tatsumaki or Fubuki or something like that, you know? Don't get me wrong, this chapter cover has introduced a new waifu for you guys, but you know, it's at least relevant to the chapter itself, because this woman in the chapter cover ends up actually being the woman that becomes Blast's wife eventually. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so let's just get right into it. So if you guys remember in the previous chapter, Blast had tried somehow fusing with Empty Void in order to restrain him in a way and get him to be taken to the Hero Association so he can be cured and become human again, but it would be at the cost of Blast's life. Now, I did have some comments on why I think this particular thing is going to come back into play at some point in the story, this like fusion that apparently you can do now. I swear this series is turning more and more into Dragon Ball as we go on, but you know, anyway, that's besides the point. Well, the fusion actually ended up being a failure, but in that time that they were kind of like intermingling bodies or whatever, Blast had actually seen portions of Empty Void's memories, specifically the moment that he accepted God's power by touching the cube. And as we all know, in the recent encounters with God that we've seen in the series, something that God sometimes does in order to trick people into accepting his power is by taking the form of someone that they admire or respect. For Garo, it was Bang, and for Tatsumaki, it was Blast. More recently, we actually got to see that for Flashy Flash, it was Sonic. So in this particular case, from what Blast saw, it ended up being someone that seemed to be Blast's wife, because we also got this final panel of Blast, this woman, and this little child, which is presumably Blue, from which we met like a couple chapters back. So this revealed that Empty Void had some kind of connection with his wife, and that left people speculating as to whether that was like her being a relative to him or this being a love triangle. To be honest, I would have really not liked it to be, you know, the latter, because like love triangle stuff and especially in this manga and anime is just, I don't know. I just thought it would kind of suck, to be honest. But gladly that's not the case, and we'll get to her in a second. Because this chapter kicks off going immediately into an Empty Void flashback. Here we see that he's fighting some kind of ninja monster in a shipyard, and the monster refers to him as his master and saying that all the training that Empty Void did for him has aided in God's plans, so obviously we can assume that he has transformed into an avatar of God, and also he's holding a cube, so you know, if it left any doubt, that kind of clears it all up, right? Well, we also see that Blast is watching from a distance, and as Empty Void gets pinned against one of the shipping containers, and it seems like he's about to get taken out by the monster, Blast shows up and uses one of his dimension cannon orbs to completely annihilate the arm of the monster that was about to, you know, finish him off. This allows Empty Void to behead the monster and quickly finish him off, and it turns out that this was actually a monster-fied version of one of his disciples called Dirty Stain, you know, kind of sticking to those stupid ninja names. This one, I don't know, they added such like a comical ninja name to such a serious moment because, you know, this is one of his disciples that was killed, but as we learned from what ninjas were taught in the Ninja Village from Flashy Flash and Sonic, Empty Void seems to be following their principles pretty closely, because it seems like he doesn't have much emotion when it came to the death of his disciple, but he notices that Blast had used some kind of weird power that he hadn't seen before, which was his dimension cannon, and in his mind he's thinking that he wants to probe him, he wants to see what he's about. So then he puts on this act like crying hysterically, crying over his disciple, claiming that he wants to avenge him by taking down God, so he wants to join Blast, when really he wants to learn about this like ability that he used and wants to learn what he's about. Essentially just become a spy, which I thought was kind of interesting because when I first saw this chapter, it was without translations. And, you know, when I'm kind of flipping through these pages, I'm not really obviously knowing what they're saying because I don't speak Japanese. But seeing Empty Void like crying, holding his disciple's head, and, you know, just seeming like he really did want vengeance, it made me think like, man, for a ninja, this guy is pretty emotional. That's a little weird. So this makes a lot more sense, that I feel like he really did want to mourn his disciple, but you know, he's a ninja. He lives by those ninja principles that you're not supposed to show emotion. Emotion is weakness. So he kind of fakes it in front of Blast, but I do really feel like he was feeling those emotions in some sense. And that kind of becomes more obvious towards the end of this chapter, because after seeing this, Blast decides that Empty Void can join him, and they start their journey on searching for the God Cubes. And one night as Blast is sleeping in a tent, Empty Void is sitting out staring out at the moon like ninjas do, when suddenly another ninja pops up from a tree, and this one is named Selenia Luna, and she's the other ninja that we saw in the chapter cover. And this turns out to be Empty Void's sister, and Empty Void tasks her with kind of infiltrating Blast and his ties to the Agoni Foundation and this secret scientist that he's working with in order to discover more about the God Cubes. Empty Void wants more intel on these things, so he sends his sister to kind of, you know, act undercover and get close to Blast. I do want to mention quickly that I just dropped some new merch. This is like the first time I'm dropping legitimate merch. I spent a lot of time working with an artist on these designs, and I decided to pick from some of my favorite anime from my childhood and ones that I enjoy right now. And I'm super proud on how they came out. I'm actually wearing one of the hoodies right now with the channel logo on the back here, if you guys can see it. But honestly, probably my favorite design and my favorite piece of clothing is this, if you guys can see it. It has the anime drop name on it, and it has a bunch of different anime that, again, I enjoy very much, kind of alluding to them on the design. We also got like some computer mats and stuff, so you can kind of see the design a little better. You know, if you notice right here, here's a certain egghead-shaped hero that you might notice. You can kind of decide for yourself who that is, right? But yeah, we got t-shirts, hoodies, those desk mats that I just showed you in different sizes. And I'd really appreciate you guys if you could support the channel by clicking the link in the description below and trying to buy some merch if you feel like it. I would very much appreciate it. But anyway, back to the chapter. What's really interesting here, though, is that he brings up this secret scientist that's working behind the scenes for Blast in the search of the God Cubes. Again, at the end of the video, I'm going to get to who I think this might be. But for now, we get this kind of like fast forwarding through time where we see Empty Void kind of like observe things going on as Luna ends up marrying Blast. They end up having a kid. It seems as this happening that this is all like part of the plan, but I do feel like Luna and Empty Void eventually started growing some human attachment here to Blast and everything that's kind of been going on. And then we cut to Luna's funeral because apparently one of the avatars of God eventually targeted Blast's wife, which was Luna, and at that point she was called Maya. That's what Blast knew her as, so I'm assuming that was like kind of her undercover name. And what I think is really interesting is that Empty Void thinks to himself during this funeral that he wonders if Blast let her die because she was getting very close to discovering who this secret scientist was, the one that was working behind the scenes with Blast for the God Cubes. That's a very interesting thought, and we get this cut to Blast, who looks very visibly upset and actually like emotionally distressed, so I feel like that's not really the case. I feel like Blast definitely wouldn't have planned for this, and just as Empty Void says in this sequence, he was overthinking it, I think. But even at his own sister's funeral, Empty Void is like, man, it's really pitiful that she died this way, like not really showing much emotion. But as we're gonna see in a second, like I feel like he was actually feeling emotions there, but just his ninja way, his ninja code or whatever, wouldn't allow him to show them outright, especially considering in the previous chapter or the one before that, where Empty Void mentions that Blast only brings destruction around him. It seems like he was deeply hurt by, you know, being involved with Blast and being involved with the God Cubes, because he did really feel for his sister and his disciple that he had to kill. And that becomes very apparent in the next sequence, because we then cut to Empty Void and Blast investigating this like ancient tomb or these ancient ruins or whatever, and they're walking down the staircase, and Empty Void looks visibly like distressed, just visibly exhausted. To be honest, this reminded me of how Suguru Geto kind of looked at the end of his arc before he became fully evil, where he just looked tired, depressed. His face looks dead and sunken in a very similar way, as he thinks to himself that he's not the type to get sentimental over his sister's death. She died because she was weak, and that's just kind of his ninja way reinforcing his way of thinking. But obviously his face tells a different story, and Blast notices this. He asks Empty Void if he's okay, and Empty Void says that he should be the one one worried about him. And in that moment, this statue with a singular eye, this like Buddha looking statue, seems to be looking down at Empty Void as it begins to shatter, and a God Cube ends up coming out of it. Empty Void kind of braces himself from the rubble as the God Cube ends up touching his forearm. And in that moment, he ends up going into the like illusion world that God sends you into. He ends up being taken to what appears to be the Ninja Village, appearing as an enormous God Cube, and two very familiar ninja are at the top of it. Them being his sister and his former disciples, Dirty Stain. I think it was his name, right? Dirty Stain? Yeah. Empty Void, of course, is confused, seeing as how he thought they were dead. But Luna just responds by saying that they have gone on a much more noble mission. And remember, I promised you guys that Saitama was in this chapter, but he ends up actually being in the very last panel, because he's still holding up the dimensional blade like he was in the previous chapter, and he's wondering what he could do with it. He's like, well, I did need a box cutting knife for all the stuff I order online, but I don't even know where I would put it. Classic Saitama trying to use something that can literally cut through dimensions for stuff like as simple as cutting boxes from online shopping. But anyway, getting to what I think is one of the more important details about this chapter is the revelation of this secret scientist that has apparently been working with Blast, or at least was working with Blast, to uncover more about the God Cubes. There are some very obvious candidates for this, like for example Metal Knight. It would make sense that he has been working with Blast behind the scenes as well. I mean, Metal Knight is also very secretive, so it would make sense that he would, be working alongside Blast, since we've seen that he has all this incredible technology at his disposal. And this might also explain why Metal Knight has been so secretive in the recent events of the series, because he knows that he's working with Blast and he needs to keep a lot of this stuff low-key. A second option could be a scientist that we actually just haven't seen before. And this might be the scientist that's behind what's going on with like Apollo and all the fake espers that they're creating apparently. All these, Tsukiyomi members, the ones that took Tatsumaki in as essentially hostage to do research on her. That's a possibility, but what I think is maybe more like, not as likely as these two options, but what I think would be kind of the cooler one, or the one that's more interesting to the story, would be Dr. Genus. And I know what you're thinking, I mean, what does Dr. Genus have anything to do with this? Well, believe it or not, I actually do think he really does have a good chance of having a connection to all this stuff, because when we initially met him, he was known as a scientist to have done many controversial genetic experiments, creating mutants, creating cyborgs. We even saw that with his like slug and frog mutants, whatever you want to call them, the ones that ambushed Saitama's apartment in like the second episode of the series. I think it was the frog one, like that one actually even knew telepathy, or I think it was the slug one actually, whatever, you know who I'm talking about. One of them or both of them knew telepathy, which is an Esper ability. So that means that Dr. Genus knows how to essentially create monsters or mutants. He knows how to create cyborgs, and he knows how to create espers in a way. So those are like the three major powers of the series. Even to this point in the manga, Dr. Genus is one of, if not the most intelligent and insightful person in the entire series. He knows about the limiter, he knows about what transforms humans into monsters in various ways. It would make sense that he would know this stuff if he was doing research on the God Cubes alongside Blast. And seeing as how keeping this person's identity a secret was so important, it would make sense why Dr. Genus would have never brought any of this stuff up when it came to like when he encountered Saitama, or when he talked to Zombie Man when he was explaining the limiter. I don't know, I think that's my dark horse candidate to who this might be. What do you guys think though? Let me know in the comments below if you think it's like Metal Knight, if you think it's Dr. Genus, if you think it's a scientist we've never seen before, or one that I haven't mentioned yet in this one that should be clearly mentioned. Like I said at the top, I do love these types of chapters very much because there wasn't like a ton of action, but there was a ton of lore building, a lot of like backstory building. I absolutely love this stuff in One Punch Man because One Punch Man is underrated for being a series that has a ton of lore, or at least a ton of unique, interesting things about the world. That is it for this one though. I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, whatever, and I'll see you guys in the next video.